So this is the third panel and the last panel of the day, titled Temporalities. We're going to have 4 presentations followed by a Q&A. And after the Q&A, Liza Grandier is going to do a performance for us. So please stay for the performance after the Q&A. Our first paper is by Yasmin Tabakovic. Yasmin Tabakovic is a PhD researcher in social anthropology at the University of Cambridge. His paper looks at the long-term effects of genocidal violence in Bosnia and Herzegovina in the early 1990s, with a specific focus on the psychosocial, affective, spiritual well-being trajectories of the people he studies. His paper is titled Fragmentary Ethnography: The Possibility of Impossibility in Living and Researching Amidst Genocidal Remnants. Thank you so much, Yasmin.
Thank you very much. Do you see? Just a second. Do you see it properly?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. Can I take this? Okay. So thank you very much for inviting me and for attending this very short talk. Thank you for the wonderful presentations up until now. They're really, really inspiring, like amazing. So I'm Yasmin Tabakovic, and I'm a PhD researcher in social anthropology at the University of Cambridge. I'm wearing a blue and white t-shirt with some patterns on it. I have a hair dot and blondish hair. I'm originally from Bosnia and Herzegovina, from Eastern Bosnia, and I'm currently living in Antwerp, Belgium. So firstly, I will give a short overview of my research in order to give a context in which my thoughts about patchwork are developing. Then I will focus more specifically on fragmentation as lived experiences of structural violence and the implications of it on doing research as a fragmentary patchwork approach. So I've been researching the long-term effects of genocidal violence in Bosnia and Herzegovina in the early 1990s, with a specific focus on the psychosocial, affective, spiritual well-being trajectories of people. It's a mouthful, I know, I'm sorry. Before the pandemic outbreak, I was mostly conducting ethnographic fieldwork in the capital, Sarajevo, but I had to interrupt my research due to a severely deteriorating sense of well-being and health. I moved back to Belgium, where I had grown up since the early 1990s, when my parents, my brother, and I fled the conflict. I continued researching from there under the reality of a pandemic disruption intertwining with an already felt disruption I was attending to. A bit more specifically, then, what I look at is the different pathways of healing, you might say, mostly Bosnian Muslims from Eastern Bosnia interact with in their search for betterment, well-being, health. These entail the psychological therapeutic disciplines, specifically what is called trauma therapy, practices of Strava and Struna, which might be approached as fear-addressing healing modalities, and online bioenergy healing, whereby a language of godly or universal energy, imbalances, and bodily energetic streams are rebalanced. My interest is not so much on distinguishing analytically between clear-cut practices, but I engage with them in their nodding and unknodding. So in other words, the reality is that most people do not engage with any single trajectory solely. Sorry, I have a problem here. Okay, sorry, there was a problem. So it's not like a singular focus, but in their multiplicities that people look at them. So it's in the realm of the messy everydayness of healing that my research is focused, I would say. In all of this, I have an intimate positionality in the sense that I'm both in specific ways part of the lived experiences of annihilation, prosecution, and alienation. And my research is mostly dependent on interactions with family members, friends of family members, and acquaintances. So this implies actually a necessity of intimacy to be possible to do this research. The reality of doing research on issues which themselves are essentially fragmented and fragmenting already is that there's often a converging tension between the impossibility of attaining any complete positivistic objective picture that the people, at least that in research often it's kind of this positivistic point of view where everything is discernible and kind of we can find it out all out there, but there is a tension here with also the surge in myself and also the people I engage with for some type of full answer, even some type of objective, one might say, answer. So this is a tension that I'm working with and focusing in. Likewise, the accessibility to people in places can be severely disturbed if you yourself as a researcher are part of the disrupted lives in question. So in other words, being in the midst of it all, so to say, means that you are most likely already battling with perhaps severe psychoaffective spiritual disturbances, severe health issues, one might say. And my text got mixed up in the notes, so that's why it's saying. But anyway, so the reality is that you are like battling these severe issues, so to say. And in my case specifically, I have officially kind of different diagnoses, which would rubric me as unhealthy, one might say, or mentally ill. I use this term very, very purposefully, but also to imply that the discourse of it and what it does with someone. So when you look at research from this point of view, and you take the reality that in our field of research, the researcher is implicitly and explicitly actually still seen as this kind of sovereign figure with seemingly extra-human capabilities of time, attention, perception, ability, and proper analytical abstraction, then you bump into clearly kind of sorts of impossibilities of being a researcher and a positioned human being who is suffering, so to say. But I would like to argue that in-depth knowledge from this position is not so much a matter of being a singular person, detached kind of in a singular place anywhere out there, but it's kind of learning to traverse the embedded multiplicities of it all. So it's learning to traverse, if you like, the different healing pathways that you are researching, but also yourself participating in, so to say. So as a researcher here, then, I have been trying simultaneously to inquire into and to integrate what happened and is happening. Now, to avoid confusion, I use the term integrate here provisionally, as opposed to a racializing and nationalistic dominant interpretation, which denotes a clear pre-given ontological whole out there to be discovered and assimilated to. But my point of view is more in line with Frantz Fanon's psychiatric political approach, which points to the work of disalienation kind of as a potential of liberated futurity, but that also takes the past as essential, but not, well, it takes the past as very fundamental, but not essentializing it. So this is kind of how I approach this to integrate. One might say then that the possibility of impossibility I'm foregrounding here is the iterative work of making sense of experiences which disfigure the commonsensical and the bodily sensible. Or to say it differently, it is an attempt at grasping the ungraspable, which points to the sensuous experiencing of distress, the limits of discursive explanatory approaches, and still trying to make writerly sense out of it. I have here a quote from Jan Navarro-Yashin, and the basic essence, what I'm trying to get at here is that none of us can do research at any given time, any day, on anything that we like, which he writes also. Of course, there are the constrictions, as already mentioned, family, care work, work obligations, and all of these tremendous burdens. But then there's also, when you look at it from the point of view of day-to-day experiences of well-being and, so to say, mental health, which stand, of course, fundamentally in this relationship with these other obligations, it makes it even more difficult. So, to say it very simply, I did not just sit down with people and talk about horrific details of one's life as if it was just another day in the office. To be really honest, there were many times when people, and mostly women, I have to be very clear here, who talked to me and I spent time with, they would tell me horrible life stories. But I barely registered it because I was so occupied and disrupted by my own directly felt feelings of distress, of pain, of dissociation also, which kind of negates this whole idea of simply being able to be active and present and engaged, etc. Of course, there are clearly gendered aspects here to the when, why, how, and with whom of doing research. But then there's also the fact that expecting a clear-cut story where all of it makes sense eventually for both me and the people I was engaging with could be highly additionally distressing because it reifies actually a therapeutic idea that the way to betterment is only through a coherent, bounded, linear story. Now, this does not mean, of course, that most people do not have constructed meaningful stories of their lives, but it is to say that these attempts at grounding often can and are disturbed by the confrontations with erasures, holes, gaps, silences, denials of living and researching amidst ruination. So fragmentary patchwork ethnography, then, I would say, is not so much a useful methodological choice amidst a couple of others to pick and choose from, but it is much more a reality for many of us through the simple fact of being a positioned human being in worlds of destruction. It seems to me that this also demands an exploration of different epistemological, methodological, ethical configurations, which foreground the necessity of intimacy, trust, and care. Now, to be clear, intimacy, trust, and care are not any types of pre-givens that point to a simple, triumphant resilience of our lives when faced with evil. They are actually often themselves very much disfigured and in need of new configurations, which are highly disruptive themselves. A perversity of structural violence and researching amidst it is that the long-termness of it all and the disruptive effects of it are literally sensed in your body, like through very intimate, minute, day-to-day, minute-to-minute sometimes experiences of trauma, one might say, depression. I mean, there are many terms we could use, but it's just to say it is a felt way of living that is not solely a discourse. And the kind of difficulty of doing research then in this sense is also that it sometimes feels like a catch-22 because I'm appealing to the necessity of intimacy, trust, and care, but at the same time, the effects of violence, of ethnic cleansing, of murder in this specific case is that these things have essentially become under attack and they have been disrupted and they are kind of, it's this battleground, to use this term maybe wrongly, where you're trying to figure out how do I engage with it? How do I build different relationships, hopefully? One way of looking at it is what Yael Navarro recently called the negative methodology, which takes up the possibility of unknowability because of political annihilatory lived experiences. So what is knowable, how it is knowable, and by whom, here is both looking into this destructed past, potential futures, but at the same time looking at the presence of it all in the present, in the political present, actually. So to end my talk, there are many implications, and I've just pointed out a couple of along the way, and many presenters have pointed out many more, but I would like to end with 4 more specific ones that came up throughout my own research. Firstly, I needed to rely on an already situated relatedness positionality to gain access to people and certain teams of research. Intimacy and trust are essentially the building blocks which I relied on to be able to spend time with people here. This allowed for research as a rigorous, but also messifying endeavor, because the distinctions between family member, friend of family member, acquaintance, and interlocutor did not exist in any clear sphere. In my case, for instance, if I were not the son of my mother primarily, I would simply not have been able to have any profound connections and exchanges with many so-called research participants. So what you can attain through this is a depth of interaction and knowledge, which simply would not be possible otherwise, given all of the constraints. At least I think so. But this intimacy essentially also does entail carrying obligations and responsibilities, which go far beyond any sort of ethical guideline that researchers or PhD students get kind of from institutionalized settings of ethics. Building further on this point, this implies also that I take long-term insights through lived experiences on board and do not pit them against a clearly demarcated fieldwork period. So if I did not have the opportunity to grow up amidst and be part of people struggling to heal from the effects of war and dislocation, then all of my insights would be reduced to a more shortened, event-oriented understanding of its workings. While now I can have a prolonged notion, which builds both on the more explicit research, of course, part of it, but also connects it to the many lived experiences, which add an insight that literally could not be there otherwise. In this line, for example, I think that Clara Hahn's recent book, Seeing Like a Child, actually shows a way of how to do this research and how to write about it. Then there's also the implication that what we consider rigorous data is not based on unobstructed access, but on a literal patchwork of having a talk for an hour here, messaging via WhatsApp with Weber there, walking to the park together here, video calling there, etc. In other words, instead of thinking that the fragmented ways of contact are something to be conquered, they become the essence through which we do research, gain insight, and perhaps live our lives more broadly in the case of fragmenting experiences. And finally, there is a sort of continual thinking and writing along and among the people we live and do our research with. So if one closes in on a search for healing, so to say, then it is perhaps not strange that any unproblematized post factum notion of writing up the findings disentangles, because you are demanded to construct together possible answers. So in other words, you are not simply a passive listener mining the information to put it into a coherent whole afterwards, but you interactively engage in building up possible helpful healing pathways, which themselves always keep on colliding against the possibility of impossibility of it all. That's basically it. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Yasmin, for this presentation. Next, we have Giza Veskalnis, who is an associate professor in the Department of Anthropology at the London School of Economics. Giza's presentation is titled Fieldwork Speculations. Thank you so much, Giza.
Thank you. Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, great. So I'm a white European woman with brown hair that's tied back and wearing a dark purple top. So I want to take up your notion of patchwork ethnography as an invitation to query the linear and deliberate temporalities of fieldwork, and in doing so to ask what kinds of knowledge are made possible by more speculative modes of research. Preparing these thoughts was really a heartening and an almost therapeutic experience. So thank you for the organizers for giving me this opportunity. Spanning nearly 15 years, my current research project has turned into a kind of intellectual and affective sprawl comprised of a growing number of research companions, approaches, and sites. Limited funding, teaching commitments, pregnancies, and childcare responsibilities have made for an ethnographic practice that I've perceived as occasionally unsatisfactory and necessarily speculative. However, I will argue that it has also allowed me to be attuned to the slow-moving development of oil exploration in São Tomé and Príncipe, a micro-island state in the Eastern Atlantic, and its manifold indeterminacies, which my research explored. So let me give you some background. The possible presence of offshore hydrocarbons in São Tomé in its maritime territory was first announced in the late 1990s and attracted a good deal of corporate attention. When I started out this research in 2007, both I and my fieldwork companions expected the successful commercialization of São Tomé oil to be just on the horizon. Like all horizons, however, this one kept retreating. Maritime boundaries have been delineated, prospecting agreements have been signed, seismic research and test drills have been conducted. However, no commercial oil discovery has been made. What the industry refers to as first oil remains elusive. I'd conceived this research as an ideal postdoctoral project. São Tomé promised to be an accessible and under-researched site from which to observe how people seek to shape the future in the face of cultural, political, and economic change affected by the impact of a multinational oil industry. I managed to make the initial seed funding that I got stretch over months, lacking the security of academic employment. And those 9 months that I spent in São Tomé in 2007 are still the longest continuous period of fieldwork I've carried out for this project. The subsequent larger funding bid to cover extended fieldwork and crucially invaluable time for writing up was unfortunately unsuccessful. Instead, I took on consultancy work for UNDP that allowed me to return to São Tomé in a different capacity. Once I did have academic jobs, and especially when my children were born, I would carry out intermittent, shorter, partly self-funded trips. Without doubt, this patchy fieldwork was facilitated by the more intimate relationships formed during my initial stay in São Tomé, but also required ongoing emotional labor. I complemented this with strategic types of interviewing in São Tomé and on the phone and via Skype at the time, as well as elements of case study research of companies and processes that seem pertinent to my understanding of São Tomé's emergent oil economy. I also did comparative analysis of reporting on other emergent African oil economies and increasingly historical research in the colonial archives in Lisbon. My research now spans a number of different sites without being explicitly multi-sited. To my mind, it also makes Marilyn Strathern's insight ring true that there are two sides to ethnographic fieldwork. One is about being in the field, the other about recreating it in our writing. Moving on from stale critiques of the unified field site, this conception of ethnography begins to draw critical attention, I think, to the time of ethnographic praxis. Haraway speaks of our responsibility as humans, knowledge producers, and ethnographers. Responsibility is a thinking, a doing, a commitment, not always entirely conscious. As my ethnographic commitment to São Tomé's perspective all grew, the questions motivating my research changed. They shifted from asking what will happen if São Toméans start extracting oil, to when will it come, to does São Tomé have any oil? There were questions that echoed those posed by my interlocutors. Looking back, I realized this shift became particularly evident when I started working on a paper that was eventually published in 2015, entitled Geology, Potentiality, Speculation. The paper focuses on the indeterminacy of achieving first oil and what I came to refer to as a pause in the development of São Tomé's oil economy, an extended meanwhile or hiatus. It is a temporal condition structured by affective antinomies and variegated rhythms and intensities embedded in fields of power. My research maps this as a series of dispositions toward the speculated future with oil, from the euphoria that accompanied the initial announcement of oil potential, to trepidations that it might result in a resource curse, to doubtful hope and the continued audaciousness of oilmen. They are readily captured in a plurality of ethnographic soundbites, such as everyone expected they would have a barrel of oil in their backyard. There's no oil, but we need to be prepared. We talked as if we already had oil. People can't just wait for oil with folded arms, or we will only extract oil when the international companies let us. And Where's the sweet spot? Is it here or here or here? We don't know. That's frontier exploration. Importantly, as Oil's precise geologic contours remain opaque and its economic value underdetermined, there's a substance to people's speculations. These sound bites convey oily affects which stick to industry infrastructures, World Bank workshops, share prices, reports, payments, corporate social investments, regulatory institutions, NGO campaigns, and people's bodies as they attempt to find the right disposition vis-à-vis oil. I learned to lean into the speculations that have accompanied this disrupted, intermittent process of ethnographic research. I do so not just by speculating myself, so filling in the gaps of incomplete and patchy knowledge through hearsay and social media chatter and news reports and so on, but more importantly, by observing the frames that make speculation as an observation of what might be and what cannot be, and even what must not be possible. Specifically, I've increasingly sought the oil companies' perspective, asking about the epistemologies and techniques that help them create promissory value, the seismic research they carry out, the data points that they are collecting that allow them to de-risk their investments, the catalysts that they need to present to potential investors, as well as the ways this translates into practices of so-called expectation management and people's hopes in São Tomé. My research has required staying with the pause. Some consider this intensity of commitment a kind of ethnographic imperative. George Marcus speaks of it as patience. Ethnographic patience flies in the face of pressures to produce knowledge in a timely fashion. Though it risks to appear always belated, its unique value, Marcus says, lies in opening up the space for multi-perspectival, critical and historically grounded work that takes all the time in the world. However, in this view, the patience to be cultivated by the ethnographer is always temporary and deliberate, rather than contingent and haphazard or co-determined by commitments other than to the research project itself. It is here that I feel a conception of patchwork ethnography makes a really refreshing intervention. It brings long-standing feminist, queer, and decolonial critiques to bear on ongoing discussions about the role of fieldwork as a fetishized and dubious feature of the discipline. It also reveals ethnography as a relational praxis of research, as we've heard from all the presentations we've heard today. A relational praxis also of theory making and writing carried out by a diversity of situated researching subjects exploring a diversity of themes and processes and phenomena. So in my case, there would be the interplay between the distractions and disruptions caused by motherhood and caring responsibilities in particular, coupled then with the privilege of growing professional stability that enabled the continuation of the research over such an extended period of time, and how this dovetailed with and generated a dispersed and expansive moment of research. So to conclude, some say all politics has now irrevocably become climate politics and post-pandemic, and this is undoubtedly true of oil politics. But what sort of ethnographic politics and knowledge might these ruptures produce? Analysts' assessments that hydrocarbon reserves will soon turn into stranded assets and that exploration activity might cease altogether seem to have become an imminent reality. While much of the world's population found itself locked down over the last year or so, oil companies in São Tomé declared force majeure, an inability to fulfill contractual terms due to unforeseeable circumstances, grounding exploration to a halt, albeit temporarily. The importance of speculative responsiveness to my research object, that is the peculiar temporal condition generated by a resource in the making, seems all the more important in this current moment. In this sense, patchwork ethnography has made for ethnographically elicited theory, to use Harrison's term, allowing the research object to emerge in dialogue with ethnographic practice. Even if not always patient or deliberate, it contains the tools for speculative work needed in the face of futures, which can always only be partially observed. Thank you. And I need to stop sharing somehow, and I have to find you for that. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Giza. Next, we have John Evran, who is an anthropologist who has done ethnographic research on soccer in Turkey. John's presentation is titled Patchwork Ethnography, Plastic Writing. Thank you so much, John.
Hello, everyone. And you hear me, right? Okay. Thanks to the organizers for the opportunity. I'm a Turkish man I'm wearing a yellow t-shirt. I have dark hair and a big, thick mustache. My paper will mostly be a reflection. I finished my PhD several months ago, defended, and I'm currently unemployed. Will be a reflection on the patchwork quality of my recent dissertation process, particularly by reflecting on the dialectical relation between fieldwork and writing. I believe ethnography is sometimes a term we use to refer to both of these processes separately, fieldwork and writing, and sometimes the term we use to denote the amalgam, the mixture of the two. I hope to share some fieldwork research experience first, and then towards the end, elaborate quickly on why it can be a good idea to think writing as a plastic exercise. I'm really happy to have engaged with the Patchwork Ethnography Facebook page in the past few months. Otherwise, I would have probably never read that Chika Watanabe lived in an apartment with her parents during fieldwork in Tokyo while working in an NGO office. She studied during the day. I did the exact same thing in Bursa, Turkey, while studying a key civil society association, a sport club in the city, and have felt terribly guilty for not having conducted genuine fieldwork ever since. Encountering a comparable narrative made me feel less guilty, I must say. But living in this way wasn't actually part of the original plan. I ended up there as a part of a safety procedure that was a bit paranoid maybe, but made sense at the time. I changed my research literally after landing in Turkey to start my year-long fieldwork. In the previous years, I had started fieldwork in a national organization headquartered in Istanbul and holding organizations across the nation and also in Germany, called the Turkish Football Federation Director of National Development. And my work was on sport bureaucracy. About several months before I was to begin fieldwork, the Turkish president started attacking around 1,000 academic signatories of a petition criticizing the government for human rights abuses. I was among another 1,000 people, academics, who signed the petition to show solidarity. But as I packed to depart for long-term fieldwork, prosecutors in Turkey collected the names of the signatories to this petition, announced that all will be charged for terrorism. That potentially included me, and I'm a citizen of Turkey, Republic of Turkey. So just as I was starting fieldwork, there was a lot of unknowns. I was in the lists. There was a lot of unknowns about the trial, pending trial. I heard some fellow Winthrop graduate students in the United States in a similar position were changing or postponing research plans, postponing research trips to Turkey, deciding it's safer to remain abroad. But I decided to go on, but I was feeling a bit insecure. And then just as I started, there was a military coup and a state of emergency, and martial law was declared. Liberal norms, rule of law, all deteriorated further. Thousands were arrested for alleged participation in the conspiracy, including left-wing academics like myself, also being put into the mold, into the basket of this mass persecution. And also was reading news that staff from my original field site were being purged for being part of the conspiracy, being part of the group that was blamed for the very recent coup. So all this didn't feel very good, honestly. And I'm really not the adventurous type. It was a political mess at the time, and I'm not sure if this adventurousness would be the right ethos to define our discipline. So I was a bit in between thoughts and a bit nervous. But at the time, as we actually, most of us do, I improvised, and there was a family acquaintance, family has come up a lot today, family acquaintance who knew I was vaguely doing research on sport, and he was appointed, he had a position as an administrative position at the local sport club, and offered me to come have a desk in this city, which is my hometown, and do my fieldwork there. And feeling time was ticking and limited, and I was a bit paranoid and nervous, and I accepted and just started spontaneously a new project as I landed in my fieldwork here. So I chose safety over consistency, and that's how I ended up with living with my parents in the city. But then my research was more and more an urban anthropology, which I'd written nothing about before, neither in my grant proposals nor my prospectus, nothing. So I was just like starting from scratch. Maybe I could have handled this panic better, I'm thinking now retrospectively, but anyway. But by the time I was back to write my dissertation, I felt, and I actually also went back quicker than I could have. I was just not feeling very secure, and but I thought what I did in the name of anthropological research was really too patchy. And my field notes felt little, as they usually do. I thought I lost precious time, etc. But this is when I realized internet connectivity and social media can very sometimes usefully blur the boundaries of field and home. And during fieldwork, I had regularly followed social media accounts driving scandals, gossip, and conflict in the community I was studying. And I had learned who was administering which key social media account. So there was some sort of physical research giving me deeper understanding of the social media tribalism, the social logic of the conflicts. But I hadn't traced interactions like a detailed investigator. And as I was writing, when going through my notes to write, I found myself regularly fact-checking by searching social media histories and going through hashtag archives to reconstruct some key events, which actually took place when I was there and present, but I thought I needed a revisit. And social media just spontaneously became some sort of a space of second layer of retrospective ethnography from a distance. And this temporal gap between fieldwork and writing felt like a useful distance in my case with the paranoia. And I treated the very time interval of my actual fieldwork as an archival duration, very digging for blog posts, local media, news coverage, Twitter, Facebook, YouTube posts, images, videos that were actually published while I was there in the manner of a historian of a very extremely recent past, with revisiting my fieldwork year like I was revisiting a historical period. It's also gave me secure anonymity from the paranoia that had sometimes caused me to shy away from entering into relations with interlocutors in Turkey, fearing that folks could Google my name, and at the time Googling could show my name in these extremely horrific news stories of the terrorist petition and this and that. And then in this archival approach, it helped that my research topic is sports, which is umbilically almost tied to recorded media publication and digital social media interaction and production. But I think this can be applied to other. But the digital time-space compression that allows for flexible research, there's also a fundamental problem that when it comes to writing. one can feel trapped by the idea that now that the connection between the time space of the field and the time space of writing is not severed, the field is too alive or too present. As you write, you have access to social events, updates, and narratives always changing, keep unfolding, as is the nature of social life. So you might feel you must interview that last person, spend time arranging that next Skype call, or etc. And dissolution of rigid boundaries can mean a world of possibility and also self-imposed expectation to be always alert while home, despite the fact that writing, we all know, I think, necessitates a measure of quiet and distance. So the voice of the field, so to speak, may echo too much and cast a shadow on the anthropologist's pen that needs to accomplish the writing. Looking back to conclude, only when I reflected on dominant concepts of anthropological writing, dominant depictions of anthropological writing, that I managed to work productively with this dilemma. I might be mistaken, but my take is that the dominant concepts that define ethnographic writing are the duo of transmission and reception, as if we are always bridges between a faraway context and an audience. Almost perhaps inspired, I think, by the growing place of telephones, televisions, and internet in our lives. And this is what social media also does. It transmits from faraway places that allows that time-space compression. So for the final minute, I want to reflect on a different conception of writing, rather as plastic writing in relation to patchwork ethnography, which is inspired by the writings of philosopher Catherine Malabou. To put very briefly, Malabou philosophizes with the concept of plasticity in order to go beyond the simplistic alternative between rigidity and flexibility. According to her, flexibility is only one aspect of plasticity, but it is a dominant image of plasticity in our age, because flexibility has become an ideological pillar of neoliberal work ethic, as precarious labor markets demand of workers and professionals to yield, to be receptive to change, mobility, adaptation, innovation, etc. Taken in this sense, the implications of the concept of patchwork can, I think, riskily align with this restricted definition of infinite adaptability. Patchwork ethnography only as flexibility of research design can mean, to quote the Patchwork Manifesto, it can mean an excuse to be more productive, or a horrible state of affairs of being forever stuck in the field and inundated by fieldwork encounters. So in fact, what Malabou wants to say about plasticity is that its discovery is useful in deconstructing previous rigidities in our time, but can come at the expense of what she calls the power to style, which refers to the active meanings of plasticity, giving form, the power to create, to invent, or even to erase an impression, I quote. This second sense of plasticity is inspired by plastic arts and hints at the centrality of erasing, cutting, editing, modifying, carving, subtracting as techniques of creation and agency, rather than just being flexible and adaptable, which is the dialectical opposite of receptivity. Plastic arts give form to plastic materials, but the essence of creation lies in the fact that these materials rigidly retain the configuration they are given by the artist, which is also what we do when we write. Anthropological writing is similarly shaped by this dialectic, which I think makes it different from the polyphonic or immersive impressionism of note-taking, where all input is welcome. Academic writing, I had to reflect, I had to understand, is mostly about making decisions to erase, cut, configure, forget, or leave out the majority of observations in search for a conceptual style and academic form, giving academic form, plastic form to field notes, which tend to be more impressionistic. I want to end by saying that patchwork methods of research can benefit from de-blackboxing conceptual style as a legitimate technique of anthropological writing, as new methods will redefine what it means to have access to the field, Plastic writing can be an ally to this democratization by working against the image of the anthropologist as ever adaptable to the demands of an overflowing, globalizing fields everywhere. Writing, I think we should sometimes think, is not passively transmitting the field for reception, but an anthropological power to style. It is the stylistic reductions that allows the concreteness of the field to legibly reach wider audiences, scholarly or public. Thank you.
Thank you so much, John. Our next presenter is Emily Lim Rogers, who's a PhD candidate in American Studies at New York University and will also be a Mellon postdoctoral fellow in disability studies at Brown University next year. Their presentation is titled, When Fieldwork Makes You Sick, Debility, Access, and Fragmented Ethnography. Thank you so much, Emily.
Thank you all. Yes, and as my new title, I take a week from now. I've been scrambling to finish my dissertation. So the talk itself is sort of paced in fragments, which itself is a product, right, of the unpredictability and precarity of the job market that we've been talking about. So I'm Emily Lim Rogers. I'm an Asian transmasculine person. I'm wearing a light blue shirt and I have yellow glasses. Okay, scene one. It's Sunday afternoon around 1 o'clock, and a group of around a dozen people log onto a video call from their apartments. Occasionally, someone's cat will walk into the frame, obscuring the camera, or a delivery man will ring the buzzer, interrupting the flow of conversation. But mostly what we see of each other are scenes of domestic mundanity. The pillow on the bed, the picture behind the couch, the dog napping in the background, the sunlight pouring in from the window, all framed in neat rectangular boxes. This is a form in which nearly all socializing takes place. Scene two. My interlocutor, Helga, tells me over Zoom that if you have to be cooped up somewhere, New York City has its relative merits. I wasn't as isolated, she says. I got to be human every day, a little bit. You know, you go to the bodega in your pajamas and you run into people, she explains. It's gotta perk you up. We laugh about the way the bodega's resident cat always tends to comfort you, even as it may be the only living thing you speak to in days. These scenes could be dispatches from a socially distanced New York City, but they are not. They are the lives that one community has lived for years or even decades, drawn from my field notes in 2019. Quarantine blanketed the city a year later, an unprecedented move, yet one strikingly reminiscent of my time conducting virtual ethnography with people with myalgic encephalomyelitis/chronic fatigue syndrome, also known as MECFS. Though shrouded in ideological unknowns and met with frequent stigma, MECFS debilitates previously healthy people, such that 1/4 of them become completely bedbound and a majority are unemployed. Its hallmark symptom is post-exertional malaise, such that activities of daily living, like trips to the grocery store, must be carefully planned out, usually only taking place a couple times a month. Its patient community is characterized by a robust online presence, with social media and Zoom enabling a tenuous form of sociality across physical distance, and despite the fact that most days they cannot leave their homes. I've been conducting fieldwork this way for 6 years, a mode of fieldwork that was unfundable during my research phase of my PhD, because it takes place quite literally at home. During the pandemic, however, virtual fieldwork became a necessity. For those of us teaching too, the pivot to teaching online was heralded as an opportunity for innovation, despite the fact that the extra work needed to do so was uncompensated. Throughout the pandemic, disabled and chronically ill communities have pointed out that remote access is disability culture. As of mid-2021, there's an increasing acknowledgement in and beyond academia that disabled people have used technologies like Zoom long before the pandemic. For instance, Ami Hamre's and Kevin Gotkin's Critical Design Lab's Remote Access Archive documents how disabled people have used technologies to socialize and connect to communities, not only during, but also before the pandemic. The project points out that disabled people have asked for remote access techniques and accommodations before the pandemic, but were told that such measures were unfeasible. I think this project counters the endless emphases on novelty that have characterized mainstream understandings of the pandemic. These ways of inhabiting the world were not new for disabled people, like the community I study, but rather became temporarily generalized to an able-bodied public during the pandemic. So if remote access is still disability culture, what forms of knowledge are left out when hierarchies of evidentiary authority and institutional funding place remote fieldwork as inferior proxies to in-person ones? I came to this project having been sick since 2011, but with a functionality that at the time enabled me to participate in the world as an able-bodied person. Over the course of my fieldwork, I slowly got worse. I went from doctor to doctor trying to get a diagnosis. And I remember thinking whatever it was something no one could figure out. But one day during my fieldwork, I was at a panel discussion with the leader of a patient activist group based in the United States, the one that I study. And she mentioned a disease that she said was frequently comorbid with ME/CFS, and I had never heard of it before. So I quickly searched for it online. And it was an emerging diagnosis. It had only gotten a diagnostic code for medical billing in 2012. It only entered the ICD in 2012, a year after I displayed the symptoms. So my symptoms of this disease thus preceded the existence of the diagnosis in Western biomedical taxonomy. So in the course of my fieldwork, I literally became sick. The diagnosis unlocked entrance into field sites that had previously been foreclosed. Because it's so frequently comorbid with ME/CFS, the diagnosis qualified me to participate in certain meetings that were reserved for patients. You're one of us now, my friend Noor told me after I came with her to a support group meeting in the Bay Area. I do not have ME/CFS, and I did not start this project thinking that I had any illness like it or would ever be as sick as them. But over the course of my graduate training, I got gradually worse. I wrote this talk from bed. I positioned my laptop stand so that the laptop can be above my lap as best as I can so I can lie down. The doctors always say that the blood will not flow to my brain if I sit upright for too long. So with all the hacks that I've made to make my life doable, I find myself now, like literally as I was writing this, in the same literal position as many of my interlocutors were when I interviewed them, from their beds, from their couches. They forged sociality by hacking their ways as they could, in a way that we might put under the rubric of Ami Hamre and Kelly Fritsch technoscience, through iPads, reclined phone calls, or simply not caring that someone saw their messy sheets, or getting embarrassed that a stranger on the internet knows that they still sleep with a childhood stuffed animal. But I want to bring in a cautionary note. Despite the sort of borderline romanticization of the ways that chronically ill people have used remote methods to make community long before COVID-19 pivoted an able-bodied public into virtual space, many of my interlocutors actually longed for in-person interaction. Brad, a white nurse in his 40s who has ME/CFS, told me about something he called healing touch. A keen observer with a bit of an ethnographic eye, Brad spoke with me at length about the variations in hugging cultures in his immediate versus extended family, and the significations of hugging for someone with chronic illness. His wife and in-laws were not so huggy, as Brad says, and he notices that his health worsens when he hasn't been hugged for a while. As a nurse, he explains his firm conviction that touch is necessary for care. There is something where it has to be skin on skin, he says, and you have to give that moment at least, where I recognize you as a human being. You know, my soul recognizes your soul, the touch. There's something very spiritual about that, and people miss out on that, he says. For Brad, hugs were constitutive of incorporation into humanness itself. He even described the dearth of touch as horrific. He says, it's practically like not feeding someone. If going without touch prolongedly can starve a person, then this is another way in which living in isolation with ME/CFS places its sufferers on the edge of social death. So it seems prudent not to mistake the reality of remote access for some kind of chosen preference among chronically ill people. And this is sort of a nascent thought, but thinking with Jasbir Puar, I think there's a question here about whether these projects reincorporate debility into celebratory modes. I think the risk is whether there's an impulse to rehabilitate impairment, not for workplace productivity in this case, but for this model of disability pride that, as Puar shows us, is very racialized. Who can claim disability pride? This is particularly true, I think, if pivots to remote learning and remote ethnography are, I think we're seeing, providing a newly justified way to cut budgets and dwindle already shrinking resources. So I think the risk is that another form of disability could become another form of diversity, reincorporated into and co-opted by the neoliberal university for its own ends. So I want to sort of like put a major pin in that. At the current juncture on the precipice of reopening, anthropologists and disability studies scholars must contend with a crucial question: how to counter the narratives of novelty while also learning from just how inaccessible both our hierarchies of evidence and physical spaces were. The lesson from these pivots should be to reveal just who was left out of both our apparatuses for knowledge production and left out from participation in public life. It means both recognizing that chronically ill people, as researchers and as subjects of our research, have been left out, while also incorporating the difference that bodies make. Virtual worlds are not inferior proxies for embodied ones, but they are also empirically part of the fabric of everyday life for chronically ill communities in ways that are not always, that cannot always be just celebrated as this sort of novel way of socializing that's new and interesting. It also sucks, you know. It sucks for, it sucks for a lot of people. Maybe not a profound observation, but one that bears repeating. And I think a final implication that I'm still sort of chewing on is this idea of remote methods as a more accessible mode of fieldwork for disabled scholars in the academy. So those are all my thoughts for now. Thanks very much for this invitation.
Thank you so much, everyone, for all these very moving presentations. We have one question in the Q&A box from Megan Moody. This question is for Emily Lim Rogers. And Megan says, this work is so important. What we use virtual contact for matters, as do the dreams of the chronically ill for what sociality is and could be. So I'm not sure if you'd like to respond to that, Emily.
Sure. Thanks very much for your question, Megan. I was glad to see you here and have been wanting to get in touch for a while. I think it's interesting that this thing with the long haul COVID thing, I'm interested in how that sort of the trajectory of that, the uptake of long COVID in biomedicine or lack thereof. I'm interested in how that might parallel or how we might track that with the accessibility lessons that we learned. Like, will people forget about it after the pandemic? Will they be reincorporated into something else? Will they radically actually change how everything is done? I think it'll be, I sort of, my thought on that is just that, like, it will be interesting to keep tabs on, but to keep tabs on them together, sort of like long COVID as a biomedical object or not. And then also sort of all these like innovative pivots, what will they happen in sort of like the fury and sort of almost mania of reopening that we're seeing, at least here in New York. You can certainly feel it, And I will be in touch. Yeah, I wanted to get in touch for a while, so I will email you.
Thank you so much, Emily. We have a question from Michelle Friedner for all the panelists. And Michelle says, in some way, all of the papers on this panel have reckoned with questions of access. Emily's paper talks about remote access. But I wonder what happens when we start with inaccess or lack of access as a mode. Why is access celebrated? And happy to pass the mic to anyone who wants to respond.
I'd be happy to, respond to that more as an observation as well, perhaps, that I was also struck by the ways in which all the papers on the panels and the others as well actually speak about that interplay between kind of forms of intimacy and their absence, if you like, and then the sort of forms of withdrawal and refusal and sort of in access, I guess, as the question posed it. So in my case, I would say, as I sort of mentioned in the paper, that I think some of my ability to continue this fieldwork over a long period of time was partly grounded in that initial access I had to people, getting to know them. There wouldn't have been another way of doing this research, I think, apart from going to a place. But obviously, I think the point that I wanted to make about my project as well is how I think the actual research praxis needs to be adjusted to the project, so that our kind of as the themes of our research change, as the research objects change, our praxis changes, so that questions of inaccessibility might not be, depending on what it is that we are looking at, the kind of obstacle that perhaps they presented for what were in the past conceived of as more traditional research themes.
Thank you, Giza. Does anyone else want to jump in to respond to that question?
Yeah, can I just say?
Sure.
There is also, if you look at it, for example, from trauma and experiences of trauma and how dominantly it's talked about, in access is kind of essential to how trauma and PTSD specifically have been conceptualized, the sort of inaccessibility of, depending how you look at it, proper memories, or is it a dissociation between the feelings and the memories? So I think when you are dealing, for example, in my case, spending time, and myself also dealing with issues that might be rubriced under the term of trauma, you're kind of always dealing with inaccessibility, in a sense that it's not simply a question of, do I have access to talk with you? But for many people, it's this whole personal experience of I don't have access to what my real experiences are, or why do I have this disconnected, dissociated experiencing of it? And I think this also complicates it, especially I think with the whole idea of negative methodology. It essentially is a point to this. It is asking us, okay, but what is the reality if things are literally not there? I mean, in my family's case, the many family members that have been murdered, friends, the literal inaccessibility of the place where I was born. I mean, in many ways, I can access it, but it's also not accessible. It's ethnically cleansed. So I think there is this tension, actually, especially in this case, that, yeah, I think is very difficult to answer simply.
Thank you so much, Yasmin. We have a question from Sarita Amrute for John Erran. Sarita says, I wanted to ask about the first and latter parts of your talk, John. How does plastic style elucidate or complicate questions of dissent and the risk of dissent for vulnerable communities around the world?
Yeah, thank you. I read the question on the Q&A, and I think I have to think about it. I'm not sure, but one thing I can say from the top of my head is that by plastic, I mean giving a bit more, let's say, creative or an active space to the anthropologist to decide on the style of exposing their observations, I guess. And I think from dissent, for example, if we think of the anthropologist in the figure of a investigative journalist, which many great anthropologists do, exposing power and dealing with dissent and political problems through writing can take the form of a sort of a muckraker or that revealing, exposing type of writing. But sometimes, for example, in my some anthropologists deal with questions of power by dealing with people who are closer to positions of power. And at that point, the decisions to write, to edit, to style writing vis-a-vis, that can take almost something like a more, writing can take a more covert or style of exposing rather than speaking on a much more, it could have take a little more, I don't know if I have to think about it, but it depends on context. This is the easy escape answer, of course, but I think it depends on the context and how that style would relate to questions of dissent. Thank you. It's an interesting question.
Thank you so much, John. I think I'll ask a question for all the panelists if they're willing to take it up. I'm curious to see if you could all say something about more explicitly about the relationship between temporality and how the different forms of temporality you've described here allow you to write non-linearly, or if maybe they don't. I mean, I'm also that would also be a way to reflect on it. But how could we actually make sense of the sort of the processes of writing non-linearly with the sort of the processes of researching in a non-linear manner?
This is not like a great answer to this is like not even an answer to the question. But one of the things I did, you're touching on this issue of writing and the relationship between the temporality of research and writing. And I think one of the things I wanted to I say that sort of like in my mind, this whole conference was about how like, we ourselves internalize the evidentiary hierarchies and as I'm writing, I find myself like the in-person field work is like the thing that I focus on. And some of it is because it is richer. Like I need to acknowledge that it is richer. And it's easier to write about in a way, right? But some of that is probably my own internalization of this is not real ethnography. So I guess I wanted to sort of just plug that, yeah, that relationship, you know, I'm finding myself what I choose to write about is the stuff that actually does fit, that sort of covers my fits and starts way of actually conducting research, because I think it's a hard thing to do, to incorporate that fits and startsness of what fieldwork was like for me, what my life, what the lives of the people I study is like, right? It's unpredictable. You know, it's you go into remission. You know, Megan Moody, who just asked a question, has written about this remission, and you'll feel better some days, you'll feel terrible others. That's really hard to write about. It's hard to fit into a dissertation, especially one that I have to rush to write. So I find myself, you know, internalizing I'm replicating the same things that we're sort of all talking about. So it's something I'm like trying to be cognizant of.
Thank you, Emily.
Maybe I can say something too about temporality. When you ask this question, I always do also historical work. Anthropologists, I'm part of that group of anthropologists who try to combine archival work with ethnographic work. And I think especially with this patchwork method, when I'm reading the patchwork materials, I think anthropologists can learn from historians, and because historians sometimes have these quick researches where they collect a lot of things, pack them, and they go back. And then when they have time to go over them. And I think anthropologists, the classic model of temporality of research is that you go and then you immerse a long time, etc. So there's that sort of more of a stagist imaginary in anthropology, where research is followed by writing, whereas I think historians do more of a back and forth crisscrossing temporality of research and writing is more common. I mean, I think historians. So I sometimes take inspiration from that to sort of keep writing, going back to sources, have that sort of crisscrossing approach.
Yeah, I mean, just to, it's a question I ask myself as well, kind of how to convey that, both the kind of long drawn outness, if you like, of the temporality of my fieldwork, but also the kind of the multiple temporal rhythms that came into it in the writing, whilst making it comprehensible, as it were, and also yeah, accessible, I guess, for the reader. But there's something else in your question, I think, which is then more kind of which resonates with me, which is about the actual writing process. Now, how can I write about something that by now, you know, recedes into memory in part? How can I bring it back? And so that's something where I want to experiment more with techniques of kind of bringing that back to myself. Now, not just through rereading field notes, but you know, through visuals, through, you know, photographs, etc., actually bringing the encounter back so that I can write about it, and making that sort of something to live in, kind of in the moment of writing again, which is another challenge, I think, with kind of fieldwork that or ethnography, I guess, that spans such a long period of time.
Maybe I can just add something. It's interesting if you also look at, for example, how psychologists and psychiatrists look at their therapeutic practices, and especially in narrative therapy, for example, which is coming from this whole idea of there are stories to be re-narrativized and, in a sense, made into a beginning, middle, and end. Even if they do not feel as such for you, it's the process of the whole re-narrativization that is therapeutic, actually. Now, there is much to be said about this and how it works, and a lot of critique, just like Nicholas Rose has criticized a lot of the Psy disciplines, and essentially this also. But it is a very difficult thing as an anthropologist, if you yourself are trying to heal, so to say, if the people you are surrounded with are clearly doing all kinds of things in a search of some type of healing, it becomes a very difficult kind of and messy also process, because on the one side, it's very difficult to start talking and exchanging ideas and interrupting and always questioning everything. Because for most people, this feels like an even more interrupted aspect of their experiences. So I think there is an element of sort of this search for coherence that you do as you write also. But how do you then make clear that the book, the monograph, the article that you have written is exactly that? It is an ethnographic place in Sarah Pink's idea, which is a fiction in the whole, you know, fictare making, what we always do. And I think we honestly don't have answers to this, because we're also on a therapeutic level in the psychology, it's a whole debate still ongoing, like what is happening. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Yasmin, for this comment. I think we will end our panel with this last thought and switch over to Liza Grandia's performance. And we've had a lot of things to process, I think, as a result of all these panels. And I hope everyone takes the time to sort of think about it, and hopefully we'll have other opportunities to extend this conversation further.